We focus a lot of time and effort on, well, how do I migrate my data between systems if that's required? I've outgrown current help desk. I want to migrate to a more robust one. I need to migrate. What data do I migrate? And the answer, in my opinion, is don't. It's not worth your time and effort. I would throw almost all of it out. I would say pull out some major trends that you need just to be able to support future decisions. Again, that would include things like volume trending, maybe some basic categorization or handle time numbers.
Welcome back to Live Chat with Jen Weaver, where we dive in to the exact moves of top support pros, what they're doing to simplify operations and elevate the customer experience. Today, we're talking with Craig Stoss, VP of Partner Solutions at Kodif. He's here to help you stop wasting time on bad data, rigid systems, and overcomplicated capacity models. If you've ever felt stuck trying to make sense of messy historical data or figure out how many people you really need on your team, this one's for you. Before we get started, this is the very first time I'm ever showing this to the world. Our QA tool, SupportMan. So if you're listening to this podcast, head over to the YouTube link in the show notes to get a glimpse. SupportMan sends real-time QA from Intercom to Slack with daily threads, weekly charts, and done-for-you AI-powered conversation evaluations. It makes it so much easier to QA Intercom conversations right where your team is already spending their day, in Slack. All right, on to today's episode. And I'm really happy to chat with you, Craig. Can you tell me a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks for having me, Jen. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Craig Stoss. I am the VP of Partner Solutions at Kodif, and I have been in the customer experience industry for almost 25 years now. I've spent a lot of time in support. I have done everything from teach children computer camps to consult with Fortune 500 companies. I've led global teams for companies like Shopify and Arctic Wolf, and now I sit with Kodif, which is a CX agent AI for your support teams to bring efficiency across all your different ticket types. And my background has always been, in my heart, the support side of the CX business and working with all those tools like Zendesk and chatbots and analytics tools and things that every support team needs.
That's fantastic. I'm so excited and honored that you're here with your experience. I think we could probably do 10 podcast episodes, but today I know you have a process about data that you want to talk about. Data is something that we've gotten requests from our audience members a lot because it's tricky to deal with support data. So just to kind of launch you into that discussion, could you tell me what's the biggest mistake you see support teams making with their data?
That's a good question. I think that there's two big mistakes. One is making your data too rigid. And by that, I mean creating these drop-down fields or fields that are restricted for certain circumstances and really kind of putting hard restrictions on how the data can be set and what data can be set at what times. I think that's a huge mistake. I think it adds friction to the agent in order to use that data and to set it appropriately. And I think it also limits the usefulness of the data in the end because you're trying to fit a lot of square pegs in round holes because the data doesn't allow you to use a round peg. And I think that's the biggest one.
So like single select fields,
Single select fields is a great example. Yeah, like that.
Mm-hmm.
Those types of data I think is less useful, especially when it's restricted single select. If you can add new fields dynamically, add new values dynamically, sure, maybe that's a better solution. And then I think the second biggest mistake is a lot of support leaders, when they come in or as companies grow, they want to migrate their data to a new system, or they want to basically recreate the old scenarios inside some new tool or some sort of revamp of an existing tool. And you end up with all these again, trying to spend all this time to figure out where all this data should sit, which you either are never going to look at again, or if you do look at it, now all of a sudden you're not comparing apples to oranges. And I think that there's so much time wasted thinking about data migration. Whereas if you just really think about why this data exists, you don't need to do it. And I feel like those two mistakes make up for the biggest time sinks, time wastes that support leadership sees when it comes to data.
Thanks for being game for just like pop question time. I appreciate that. But I know you have you have this process you want to share with us about data. Would you tell me what, if I'm, on a support team and I'm just beginning to think about data, what's my entry point?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that it's a stage thing, right? I mean, at initial stages, the support leaders often that the worry isn't the data. The worry is just like we need some tool to help us manage incoming tickets. Maybe we're a startup, maybe we're a small e-commerce mom and pop shop, whatever it is, but
Mm-hmm.
we need just something to manage the incoming volume. We don't care about reporting necessarily. We don't care about slicing our customers up by VIP versus non-VIP.
We
All
just
we
don't
care
want to use
about is
Gmail anymore.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the important thing. And so what happens there is that because of that, because there's no vision, and I'm not even arguing that's a bad thing, not having that vision, you set your system up in a certain way. And then what happens is that as you evolve, all of a sudden you start adding in new pieces of metadata. So, if we look at a timeline, maybe time 0 plus 5, all of a sudden you add this one field, and then time 5 plus another 10, you add in some other metadata. And now all of a sudden you have this data, but it's not consistent. It's not, it's not comparing apples to apples. Maybe that data from time 5 is evolved by time 20 so that it has new fields, and so now you end up with this kind of set of data that is not complete. It is not clean. That's one path it goes. The other path it goes is where someone wants to be smarter than the future, and they start to try to think about, well, how can I build that vision? So they want to over engineer at the start, which again, I'm not faulting, but what happens is that you start to build this over engineering in, and again, you're fast paced. Maybe you only have one engineer or one support agent that's helping you. They're not setting this data. They don't have time to fill that out, and it doesn't align with anything that actually happens in the future. Maybe your vision was wrong, for example. So you end up almost always with unclean data. And again, I don't fault anyone for that because I think that's how you have to start. The process I would take is that as opposed to trying to, when you are ready for data, when your business is in the point where you need to start using customer feedback, customer trending, you need to start doing capacity planning, you need to start building structured dashboards and reports so that you can report to the business what you're doing. The problem starts at this point because you almost in every scenario, your data is going to be unclean. It's not going to be in a usable format. The mistake that I see so often is that we try to force it to be clean. We either try to go back in history and change stuff, or we uh, try to build assumptions into it, or we just report on it and tell the end user that's reading it, well, this isn't accurate, but this is where the trend is going, and that obviously has a lot of thumb in the air, type logic to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can feel the impulse to do that. Like if I'm just scrapping all my past data, I have I have nothing. I need that data, right?
That's the impulse, right? The impulse is I need data, but if the data isn't representative of something useful, then I would argue you don't need data. I've seen so many people who say, "Oh, there was a sudden spike in this type of ticket," the root cause was literally that someone found out that that type of ticket was a selection and told the team, and they just started using it. It had nothing to do with the reality of the
Oh,
tickets
I've done
that were
that
coming in.
before. I've been a support specialist and just like I have to use this single select field. I have to do something. I'm in a hurry. My numbers matter to like my compensation. So I just need to pick something
Yeah.
and it's not representative. And I'm just embarrassed that I have been that problem, you know?
So Yeah. So, and I think every company, every leader feels this, right? I mean, especially in support where I don't. I'm sure everybody listening to this can resonate with, your boss coming to you and say, "I need to know this exact number now. I need to know, how many of our gold star customers opened critical tickets over the last 2 quarters. Give that to me by end of day today." And you're like, "Uh, okay, I'll see. That's not a report that I have." What's interesting is I think that, and this is a bit off topic from this conversation, but I think that this stuff is getting easier now, right? The tooling reporting is getting a lot less static in the new kind of AI world. There are tools that exist now that can go back and infer stuff, can make judgments, and not only that, you don't even have to start building these reports based on fields as we're traditionally used to. In Salesforce and Zendesk, and these tools where you have to kind of say, well, I want this field trended over this period of time, and I want it, split based on this metric, and I want it filtered by only these types of customers. Like that's a very traditional way of thinking about reporting, but there's now tools using AI that you can just describe what you want. I want, and put in whatever your boss said to you. Gold star customers, last three quarters that opened critical tickets, and it can go back and figure that out, right? And be able to correlate data from multiple systems to make that intelligent report for you. And that that's solving a lot of this problem because you don't have to rely on that rigid data that I said earlier, or Jen, to your point of, hey, just pick something because I think this is right. The AI is picking that something and being able to categorize that ticket in many different dimensions.
Hmm.
So I think this problem is slowly going to go away.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see that. I can even see um, AI being able to look at the full text of a conversation and categorize it, if like after the fact, right? That makes total sense to me. But so, and I think from talking to support leaders, I'm getting the impression of what you're saying, which is we often come into organizations where we're maybe the first hire or it's a new support team and the data, like you said, just hasn't been there. So what do we do from there? How do we
Yeah.
land on a support team and then start from now forward?
I think first and foremost, the most important thing is to decide what data is likely to have some sort of impact to your business. What data is actually going to change something about your business. I mentioned capacity planning. Capacity planning is almost entirely based on the volume of tickets and the time it takes to handle those tickets. You don't need to know necessarily all the categories of tickets in order to get those two numbers out of a system, right? And so that will impact your business. That's an important thing that you need to make sure is consistent and something that you can compare over time. I think that's a really easy example.
So what are the data points for capacity planning that you recommend? Like the kinds of data?
It depends how robust you want to get, I suppose. But in general, literally, you would measure number of incoming tickets or emails or phone calls, depending on how your omni-channel is set up. Um, Chats is obviously huge right now, but you would measure that pure volume number from your system. Maybe it is split by channel, in which case that as you grow or expand different channels, you can start to see which channels are trending better. So there might be one split in that, but I would split it much more than that, right? I think it's capacity planning is really about the volume and then the handle time for that. Now, handle time is interesting because there's all sorts of ways to measure handle time, right? And it's a metric that I think is everyone measures, but no one is everyone has to pick a way to measure it, but it's not consistent from company to company. It's not even consistent leader to leader within a company, right? And so you need to choose which way you think about it. Do you think about it as like the actual time spent working a ticket? And does that include, if the agent has to go and make some manual actions in another tool, like, go out to a Shopify or go out to an order management system and take action? Does that time count? Does responding to that person count? If you're doing three chats at once, is that three separate handle times, or is that all just, one unit of time? There's lots of stuff that goes into it. There's a For high volume places, there's a methodology called the Erlang model. In fact, if you go to my website, stoss.ca, I actually have an Erlang calculator that I build to help leaders with some of these things, because I think that's an interesting way for high volume companies to do capacity planning. That requires a whole other set of data around, uh, when your tickets come in, what are your arrival patterns of tickets. So it. I would say that to answer your question, it really depends on how you want to do capacity planning. The simplest is literally two metrics: volume and the average time it takes you to handle that volume. It could be literally two numbers over a period of time. So maybe daily, weekly, monthly, um, quarterly, whatever it is. But there you can get much more advanced. As I said, you could split it by channel. You could split it by hour of the day of the week. It really depends on how in depth you want to get. But the key is, for that specific use case, minimize that to something that's going to actually deliver impact to your business.
I'm really interested in what you said about the calculator. It sounds like, you said there are many ways to calculate handle time and to deal with capacity planning, but it sounds like you have an opinion about what's the best way because you built that calculator, right? Can you just speak to that for a second?
I hesitate to use the word best. In fact, at a previous company of mine, we actually built three versions of the Erlang model because we felt that there was three different kind of levels your business had to be at to use different levels of the calculation. So the base one is what I said: trending, volume, and handle time divided by number of people. There's your capacity. Uh, and then, then the one that's on my website is literally, here is the exact number of people you need per hour per day in order to cover the volume that you're predicting. So, that gets pretty intense, and you probably be pretty high volume to start thinking in that direction, right? Because, and then if you have multiple channels, that adds another layer of complexity on that, because it's like, well, you need three people to handle, or five people to handle your email channel, and you need 10 people to handle your phone channel or something. And how do you staff to make sure that that's minimized? Is it just 3 plus 10, or is it maybe that the phone people can handle emails while they're not on the phone, and is it blended? So my opinion is that you shouldn't overcomplicate it. I think, again, going back to wasted time, this is not to do with data, but I think in general, we worry too much about capacity, and this might get me in trouble with some purists, but I think that we spend so much time worrying about the calculation and making sure the numbers are accurate for something that we can't predict. We can predict within, we're smart enough to predict within some amount of reasonable estimates, of all, volume increase. E-commerce is a great example of this. I work a lot with e-commerce companies at Kodif, and we talk a lot about, how many tickets are going to come from an order? Like what's the average volume of tickets based on my order volume? And therefore we know if order volume goes up for Black Friday, we know how many tickets are going to come, give or take, right? But that's still very simple. I have people that try to extrapolate that, on a week or daily basis, and they just get so bogged down in these numbers that they lose accuracy because of the number of variables they put in, right? Because each variable has its own variance within it. So statistically, the more variables you use and the more variance each of those variable has, the less accurate your last your last estimate is gonna come out. And so I think my opinion is to figure out a method, make it as simple as your business requires, which again, at high volume might mean a full Erlang hour by hour calculation, but certainly not every business needs that. But make it as simple as possible, and then stick to it. And if you discover, maybe a quarter or two in, that there is some error in your calculation, then correct for it. But don't try to be that visionary of like, I'm going to account for every. I've had people try to account for, well, person is sick one day a month, and that typically happens on a Monday, and no, what's the number of vacation and sick days that you see in a year? spread that over the year, and that gives you your shrinkage number that you need to put into your calculation so that you, but it's an average. It'll never be accurate. You might have 10 people sick one day and your business is literally crippled. There's no way to predict that. There's no methodology in the world that will predict that for you. At least not until robots, AI gets a lot smarter. So, yeah, that's my opinion. Don't make it complex because it will always be wrong.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's a piece of that too that has me, that this question burning in my brain, which is I've talked to a lot of support leaders about metrics and capacity planning. And the pieces that you mentioned are crucial. But the other piece is how much time out of a full-time individual contributor is ideal for them to be in the queue. So I've talked to leaders who say, a percentage of, for specialists, especially after they mature with the company and they've been there a couple of years, they need to be doing something else in addition to work with customers. And I've heard different ideal percentages of that time work with customers versus internal work. Do you have thoughts about that? Because that factors into that calculation, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, Again, as with most answers in this world, the answer is it depends. So there's really two types of things that affect your full time workers. So let's just assume an 8 hour day, just so we have a starting point, right? So the first is occupancy, and occupancy is the amount of time that is spent in the queue um, directly. And in some call centers, it might be close to 100%, right? Because you might be hanging up a phone and the next call just immediately rings into your ear and then you hang that up and there's all like think of like the airlines and telecom companies, right? There's no downtime. Like when you are working, you are 100% working. You're never waiting for a ticket to come in, right? And I would argue that that leads to burnout. I would argue that leads to unhappy employees.
Mm-hmm.
I would leave that happens to bad data in the sense that you're obviously not going to log stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably not ideal. I kind of use the 80% as my starting point for most teams. Now it can fluctuate. I ran a tier three team for a long time where the amount of time waiting for tickets, the occupied for new tickets was like 20% because these tickets that they did get were so highly complex that they spent 80% of their time working on the existing tickets they had in their queue, right? And so it is going to depend on your team, but I tend to start with something around 85% as my goal. That way, 15% of the time, and again, if you take that in an hour basis, right, that's 9 minutes of every hour is kind of downtime that they can wait for a next ticket, edit some notes, maybe follow up with another customer, go to the washroom, maybe whatever it is, but just have some downtime, right? And the second one is shrinkage. So there's two types of shrinkage. There's shrinkage that's inherent to the business, usually called internal shrinkage. So that's things like a team meeting, right? So if you have 1 hour team meeting per week, what percentage of time is spent there? So again, if we assume a 40-hour work week, 1 hour is 1/40th of your time. Maybe you have, maybe there's other meetings that someone attends. For example, you said as someone gets more senior, maybe they attend an engineering meeting or they attend, a product meeting to understand what's happening in the site, the product or
Mm-hmm.
something to that effect, or some sort of status update meeting, or maybe there's an all hands meeting that's once a month. How I calculate this is I basically list out all the internal reasons why someone is not going to be working in the queue. So that could be one-on-ones, all hands meetings. It could be lunch breaks. It could be anything to break time. Like if you get 2 15-minute breaks a day or whatever it might be, that is stuff that the business gives to you, right? As part of just operating the business. That number, I mean, it can vary. I see it around 10-15%, somewhere in there, of shrinkage of your time. But it could be it could be lower depending on the nature of your business. Then there's external shrinkage, which is the time that you take. So that's like vacation, sick leave. That could encompass things like parental leave if you have a policy around that. It encompasses anything that would disrupt you as an employee disrupt in your and that number again is usually a lower percentage overall, but obviously it has impact to it. So if you take your shrinkage and then you say, okay, my 40-hour work week is reduced by, let's use 15%. So 40 hours is reduced to, what's that, 34 hours of actual availability. And then my occupancy is 80%. So I reduce that number by a further 20, which is another six and a bit, so let's say seven. So that gets into 27 hours that someone is actually available in the queue on average. Of course, some weeks it might be closer to that 36. Some it might be lower than 27 because they take a vacation day, right? So uh, that's really the basics of that calculation. And um, again, don't overcomplicate it. Like trying to figure out, oh well, people take more vacation in the summer, so let's up it for the summer and lower it for the winter. Why? Again, what if I get sick in the winter? More people are sick in the winter than they are in the summer. Do you want to? You have to predict people's, cold schedules and flu schedules. It it's just simple averages. And the law of averages is, especially if you have a big team, it's harder if you have a team smaller than 10, 50 people. But if you have a 20, 30, 40, 100-person team, the law of averages is saying you're going to have the same number of people out every day sick just because, right? And the
Because they're
ones that
human.
they're human, yeah.
Hmm.
It's just the nature of it, right? And the ones that abuse that, I had an example where I had an employee who loved his football on Sundays and loved it so much that he called in sick many Mondays. And that's a performance issue. That's not a problem with your capacity planning. That's a individual abusing a system that wasn't meant to accommodate for hangovers.
Yeah. And so, in addition to capacity planning, which covers all that, what are some other metrics maybe new support teams need to start thinking about moving forward, not
Yeah.
going back to past data?
No, so again, I'll bring it all back to what impacts the business, right? So, we focus a lot on categorization of tickets, right? And maybe um, some levels of categorization need to always be there. For example, what percentage of tickets result in bugs? That's an interesting metric you might want to, especially in the SaaS world, might be interesting. Product world, what percentage of tickets are related to a product arriving broken or damaged, or what percentage of tickets are refund requests or return requests? Because those will have an impact on your
Hmm.
business, right? There's cost to those things.
And like you were saying earlier too, they're also manipulatable. Like, what percentage of tickets lead to bugs? We can put the engineering team on that and fix that over time, or at least diminish
Exactly.
it. Yeah.
100%, right?
Yeah.
That's why I say start with what impacts your business, because yeah, priority of a ticket from 2 years ago is probably not going to impact your business. But if the number of bugs month over month has increased as your product complexity has gotten higher, that is an impact to your business. That's an impact to your customers. That's an impact to the number of engineers you need to hire. So support data is going to impact how many people engineering hires. I mean, that's something that people need to know and see that trend, right? And it's pretty cut and dry. That's something that always typically remains apples to apples, right? The definition of a bug doesn't change. The category of where that bug is might change because you might add new parts to your product, you might change parts of your product, you might pivot your entire company. So you probably don't that data is probably less relevant over time, but the fact that you had a bug remains the same, right? And so as a percentage, over that's a really relevant metric. Before AI solutions to this problem, I had my team. We laid out 6 categories of tags, the ways that you could describe a ticket, and that they were, for example, things like the feature that was being used, the type of action. For example, was it an edit action, a create action, a delete action, an update action? So it was like, yeah, feature, action type, things like, was it an end user? Was it admin? We had different types of
Yeah.
customers.
For
This company,
business
different,
support.
yeah, different
Hmm.
business users. But we had 6 categories. And the agreement was with the team that you would categorize a minimum of 3 categories per ticket that were relevant, because sometimes not all 6
Mm.
were relevant, but you had to have a minimum of 3. And that was excellent for data, because now you can start to see it was fluid because the product evolved, and we could start to add new categories as we learned about them or as we saw these trends. Um, it was a bit subjective, as is any human solution, but it worked. It worked quite well. We can report that data to other departments and say, look, our admins are struggling here. Uh, Updates are failing, in this particular feature, whatever it might be. We could be really descriptive. AI can now do that. I won't say for free, but pretty easily. It's certainly more accurately than a human could.
And that saves specialists time and effort too, if they can just close a conversation and
Absolutely.
know that whatever tool you're using will gather that data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think the last piece is, as your business expands, right? You might start a tier 2 team, or you might need to start understanding. Maybe specialization is important to you. So you have people who specialize in different areas of your product. And I think if there's data you have on that to help you build that team in the future, that's useful. But again, if that's not available, don't force it, just start using it. Like, pick a date and say, from this date forward, we know that we can categorize tickets in a way that say, here's a specialization that we could potentially have. And again, there is some visionary stuff here that I'm not always a fan of, but at the same time, most support leaders have a gut feeling on, oh, this is a specialization. This is a completely different skill set than this part of whatever. Maybe refunds and accounts is a completely different specialization than an app bug, right? Like, those are different skill sets, and eventually we likely will specialize to split those out so that refund is not handled by a technical bug analyst, and a technical bug analyst isn't handling the opposite, right? A refund person is not handling a technical bug. So um, those are things that I think are data that you would immediately need to keep or start doing at a certain scale.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I know we're coming to the end of our time. Is there a couple of things? One, is there anything else you want to add to the data conversation to kind of encourage support leaders? And also, if I'm a busy support leader and I need to just throw out, 90% of all the many metrics, what should I focus my, hour per week that I have to work on
Yeah.
data?
I think there's 2 things that I'd like to touch on. One, I mentioned migration right at the top of the episode, and I think, again, we focus a lot of time and effort on, well, how do I migrate my data between systems if that's required? I've outgrown my current help desk. I want to migrate to a more robust one. I need to migrate. What data do I migrate? And the answer, in my opinion, is don't. It's not worth your time and effort. You talk about throwing up 90%, which we can come back to in a second. I would throw almost all of it out. I would say pull out some major trends that you need, just to be able to support future decisions. Again, that would include things like volume trending, maybe some basic categorization or handle time numbers. But you do not need to have a ticket. Again, the category of a ticket from 12 months ago, or the priority of a ticket from 12 months ago, is not going to impact your business in any way. And even if it were, what you define 12 months in the future is not going to be the same just because your business is involved. Planning a migration at this scale, to me, is a waste of effort in 95+% of the cases. Now, to answer your other question, um, if I were to throw out 90% of the data, I think I would start with everything that I know I won't ever look at again. And in most cases, that's your email threads, right? You don't need to maintain an entire email thread from 12 months ago. Now, you might want to, and this is what we're going to talk about in our next episode, AI and stuff like that. You might want to maintain summaries of that information or word clouds of that information, but the actual email thread itself is irrelevant. I would throw out almost any date related data. Like we store things like, deadline dates or follow up dates of, how many tickets did lost SLA in, over a month. Anything like that. That's just not going to be relevant in the future. It's not going to change your business. That's a real time performance metric. It's something that you use to coach an agent, or you use to hire, inform a new hire, or the worst case, inform a layoff. To be honest, that stuff is not going to be useful outside of the real time analysis. Schedule information certainly can go right. I've already talked about priorities and things, so I think I would focus on the basics. If you want to keep some of these trends, use a business intelligence tool, like Google Looker Studio or something to that effect, that you can put it in that type of tool, or even just in an Excel spreadsheet. Put this trending data there so you can refer to it, but just be selective. And I would say, yeah, certainly the biggest chunk of it is all the back and forth email threads. No one needs to store that in any capacity. Start fresh with new data, new systems that are able to categorize your tickets in a way that helps your business.
That's refreshing. I remember being a support leader when we moved from one help desk to another, and I just felt like I need these threads for some reason, and I never used them, right? But
Yep.
I felt like, what if a customer comes back and says something and I have to refer to something? And it just never happened.
Well,
You
it
know?
won't happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here and for chatting about data. I really appreciate it. Can't wait to have you on the podcast again.
Thanks, Jen. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much to Craig for sharing his hard-earned insights. He also has a free Erlang calculator at stoss.ca. That's his website, stoss.ca. And as always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please hit that subscribe button, share it with a fellow support leader, and subscribe to our newsletter. That's in the show notes to keep these tactical tips coming your way. All right, so let's review the steps that Craig went over. Step 1, stop overcomplicating your data structure. Step 2, don't waste time on historical data migrations. Step 3, choose a simple and consistent capacity model. 80% tends to make sense. Step 4, factor in real-world time for your team, not just ideal capacity. Step 5, only track data that drives meaningful business decisions. Thanks for being here. And until next time, keep it simple and stay focused on what really moves the needle.